capital deployment following the routes of distortion, on the present strategy will confer even greater advantages. It truly pays to take a roundabout route toward roundabout capitalistic production. That is, our Austrian Kinder, Austrian Investing 1 and 2, get along well together. The former well hedges the latter, and the latter is the superior deployment of capital to which the former serves. In Austrian Investing is a cohesive whole of intertemporal opportunism and the roundabout acquisition and construction of the factors of production. Indeed, from the strategic framework and logic accumulated through the entirety of this audiobook comes an effective framework for investors of all stripes and means. Value Investing, Austrian Investing's estranged heir. Austrian Investing 1 and 2 should both sound somewhat reminiscent of what has come to be known as value investing. Indeed, Austrian Investing can be seen as value investing's intellectual forerunner, not only drawing on insights older than value investing, but, more significantly, providing clarity and focus to its underpinnings and ultimate systematic source of return. Although their paths cross at times, value investing does not strictly follow the Dao of Capital. There are significant differences, largely in the thinking behind the strategies, most specifically Austrian Investing's deliberately roundabout approach, rooted in a firm understanding of its edge. No mystery, as claimed by value investing's founder, in its pursuit of Siegfried opportunism. Thus, we can say that Benjamin Graham, considered the father of value investing and security analysis itself, and the horde of value investors who have followed his treatises are, in effect, an estranged brood of Austrians, an unwittingly splintered faction. Understanding the differences should help us refine, focus, and improve the broader approach of value investing, and perhaps coax some to the orthodoxy of the Austrians. Such adjustments to what is already an ingrained approach, as well as a better understanding of the real source of information and edge in the approach, as we will see, can be most productive. Benjamin Graham was born Benjamin Grossbaum. The family name means large tree in German, so apropos since he came so close to the archetypal conifer strategy in London in 1894. The surname was changed on account of the German prejudice surrounding the Great War. The family moved to New York when Graham was a year old and enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle until his father died in 1903 and his porcelain business began to fail. His mother turned the family home into a boarding house and then borrowed money to trade stocks on margin, which left the family in poverty after the crash of 1907. After attending Columbia University on scholarship, Graham became a clerk in a bond trading firm, then an analyst, a partner, and finally principal of his own firm. A Keynesian interventionist, particularly regarding the inadequacy of consumption during economic downturns, Graham extolled a commodity-based currency that was very similar to the so-called Ford-Edison money of Chapter 5, and, like Keynes, he was blindsided by the great market crash that came at the end of the Roaring Twenties. Ludwig von Mises, as we recall from Chapter 7, had little company in predicting the Great Depression. Graham, the Dean of Wall Street, lost nearly 70% of his largely arbitrage portfolio in 1929 through 1932. This would become a most formative experience for him, likely responsible for much of his value investing principles that would evolve. This was a purely inductive lesson, establishing value investing's legacy of remembering the Depression, though without ever recognizing the distortion that caused it. Graham's opening line of security analysis, from Horace, though it could be right out of the Lao Tzu, "Many shall be restored that now are fallen, and many shall fall that now are in honor," tells the paradoxical story of the monetary-fueled market swings we saw in Chapter 9, and in that is a pretty good, though overly simplistic, approximation of Austrian Investing 1. There is perhaps no better illustration of his central margin of safety principle in action than Figure 9.3 in the downloadable PDF. In Graham's metaphor of the bipolar Mr. Market is a sound, though proximate, approach to avoiding the ultimately Austrian-explained traps of distortion and entrepreneurial incompleteness of the imaginations. Had he heeded the Austrians, he no doubt would have diagnosed the real causes of Mr. Market's personality disorder. There is much common ground between value investing and its Austrian predecessor. Certainly value investing is as close as we come to it in practice today, having become a popular intuitive approach, though I would argue that a small percentage of the value practitioners truly share the original focus laid out by Graham in his authoritative texts, Security Analysis in 1934 and The Intelligent Investor in 1949, the same publication year as Mises's English-language version of Human Action. One might say that Graham gave the practice of investing a rigor, logic, and entrepreneurial orientation not commonly seen before, and in that he was very Austrian. As Graham famously noted, investment is most intelligent when it is most businesslike. Perhaps Graham's greatest insight was to stay out of the shadows of securities markets, ignore the sideshows, and instead focus entirely on the entrepreneurial action itself, the business, the capital. A diligent researcher of stocks, he had a laser focus on capital as the tangible asset and the thing that is ultimately owned in a stock. We can see this in the MS index and the Faustman ratio, as well as Graham's price-to-book ratio, or P over B, which simply compares a firm's equity to its total net depreciated book assets. All three ask, what is the whole relative to the sum of its parts? It is not clear whether Graham ever read Faustman or the Austrians directly. Though he was fluent in German, he admitted to being unschooled in economics. In his P over B approach alone, Graham had good results. After adding a litany of quantitative screens, from debt restrictions to long-term earnings and dividend growth, and stability to price-to-earnings, P over E ratios, spelled out in his book, The Intelligent Investor. Over his long career as an investor, he did quite well. His multi-ingredient, quantitative stock portfolio recipe is the stuff of modern-day financial engineers. We might say, however, that traditional value investing has been something of a misnomer. Traditional value stocks, defined by low P over B and P over E ratios, have been shown to have statistically similar revenue growth as traditional growth stocks, and have had lower ROIC than growth stocks. This is yet another instance of naively treating all capital as the same, as a homogeneous blob. Consider that P over B and P over E ratios are utterly incommensurable unless we assume all firms have the same basic capital structure. In reality, firms have different degrees of roundaboutness, and hence variability in their ROIC. Indeed, investors must always delve deeper into the means of economic profit, certainly a central message of this audiobook. Between Austrian investing and value investing is again the difference between depth of field and the telescopic long-term. The latter is about waiting patiently over a long interval, as if for a far-off coupon at the very end, the plodding tortoise, or Marco sitting with his rod. The former is about patience now in gathering the factors of greater potential coupons to come, the accelerating tortoise, hare, or Crusoe. Both require discipline and patience, but Austrian investing is concerned with the intertemporal process at work, rather than just the endpoint. Interestingly, the man who is most closely associated with value investing today, Graham's one-time pupil and perhaps one of the most successful investors in history, Warren Buffett himself, once had a close brush with the Austrian school via his father, Howard Buffett. In a letter from 1962, Howard wrote to Austrian economist Murray Rothbard, seeking a copy of his book, The Panic of 1819, for his son Warren, who is a particularly avid reader of books about panics and similar phenomenon. It is apparent that, despite the son's later vocal criticisms of much of what could be considered Austrian orthodoxy, his basic investing actions are more closely aligned with it than he would ever admit. Most have forgotten how unpopular and even ridiculed Warren's yielding, Zohua, and very Misesian cash position was in the late 1990s. Over the years, value has sprouted many variations on the Austrian Grahamian theme. In 1992, Eugene Fama and Kenneth French formalized a value factor, which was basically Graham's P over B measure. Another approach, called the Magic Formula by Joel Greenblatt, combines our traditional ROIC screen with a simple EBIT relative to enterprise value screen. And there is a similar screen known as quality, whereby high gross profits to assets, which avoids penalizing high capital investment, and low P over B ratios are selected. These cover the variation gamut, though there are certain countless sub-variations on these, including their intersection, such as perhaps the approach of Buffett, and in fact triangulate or cross-verify the Austrian Investing 2 approach. All introduce noise by assuming additional degrees of freedom, too many to name, in this case of Graham's intricate screens, heterogeneous capital productivity, in this case of Fama French's sole P over B parameter, heterogeneous EBIT growth rates, in the case of Greenblatt's growth-sensitive P over E parameters, and heterogeneous capital depreciation and thus productivity, in the case of Quality's depreciation-free gross profit parameter. But as much as they might approximate this approach, they fail to necessarily isolate what matters, roundabout capital and its price. So we should expect these variations to capture some of the Siegfried portfolios, some of their edge, but with some added noise, evident in lower returns resulting from lower information content in the screening methods used, as well as inconsistencies across a range of portfolio construction methods employed. To see if this expectation holds, I tested the performance of these portfolios. In my experiment, I own 40 stock positions for 1 year, and I stagger how many I buy in each monthly mini-portfolio in different ways, as well as limiting how large each mini-portfolio as well as each position may swell before constraining it. Such variation and somewhat arbitrary portfolio construction techniques result in essentially different portfolio constituents, and thus nicely reveal a degree of luck and inconsistency in some of these results, as well as remove much of any ability to optimize, thus keeping the author honest. All portfolios share the same screens, ranging from tradability, size constraints, and general noise constraints. I start the tests in 1978, as before, which once again doesn't impact the relative results. Figure 10.5 of the downloadable PDF shows the range of performances found, as well as the mean performance across this range. Here we see a literal stair-step up from the naive capitalization-weighted S&P composite up to our most pure and archetypal Austrian approach, the Siegfried's portfolio. It is not an evolution, as the top step came first in the historical development of these approaches, and the others sporadically branched from each other, but it is nonetheless a refinement of both the methodology and, most importantly, of the thinking behind them. The point is that we have a methodology that separates the wheat from the chaff, focusing on what matters and ignoring what doesn't. In this, and to its credit, the value approach has come very close. But focusing the mind does so much more than just adding an additional 5 to 10 percentage points to what some smart investors are already doing pretty well. Most importantly, it provides a logical and sound basis for understanding the why. The rigor and appeal of Austrian investing is in the intuitive logic of its principles. Even before we test, we know why our edge exists. For most value investors, even when they see the edge that their approach provides, they do not comprehend it, typically relying on mere nebulous long-term price mean reversions. And Graham famously called it one of the mysteries of our business, and it is a mystery to me as well as everybody else. They thus remain susceptible to being swept away by the next seemingly attractive investment scheme and distorted environment to come along, as even Graham himself was in the late 1920s. Truly, the why is all that matters when we are faced with our profound intertemporal constraints amid investment results that appear, to the Phineas Gages among us, unacceptably inconsistent, even recklessly irresponsible. Understanding that we are investing in a means to subsequently greater profitability, not greater profits themselves, we see that we must take the detour in order to gain the intertemporal edge of greater tools. Such thinking clears our field of view, giving it that all-important depth. When considered as a somewhat noisy and tweaked version of Austrian investing, perhaps value investing's mystery can be put to rest. Production that leads to entrepreneurial profit is an exceedingly roundabout process, which takes time and capital, and thus patience in acquiring the indirect means of that process. We should not expect such entrepreneurial profit to be easy or even desirable, as it starts the process, and made even less desirable by monetary distortion. To those who understand, and can thus suffer through the process, go the spoils of capitalism. A Zweck finally attained. In Austrian Investing 1 and 2, we have finally reached the destination, the Zweck of the Dao of Capital. When brought together, Austrian Investing 1 and 2 are nested roundabout strategies, the first used to deploy the second, the grand sure strategy of the Taoist sages. Each is a mittel to a higher Zweck, culminating in maximally productive capital investment and reinvestment, a progressing economy and civilization. The strategies are quintessentially Austrian, with Austrian Investing 1 relying on concepts developed by Mises, and Austrian Investing 2 relying on concepts developed by Baumbaumwerk. However, as stated in Chapter 9, Austrian Investing 1 is very difficult for most investors. The only applicable takeaway will be to avoid the stock market when distortion elevates the MS index. Fortunately, the Dao of Capital does not require that investors simultaneously employ Austrian Investing 1 and 2. Both Austrian Investing 1 and 2 can be pursued even as standalone strategies, as each on its own beats the vast majority of professional results, to exploit distortion, which also includes the basic Misesian strategy of Chapter 9, and to identify and invest in mispriced productive capital. As a devotee of the Austrian school all my adult life, and having had the pleasure of delving more deeply into the texts during the writing of this book, I can say without question that the influence of the men from Vienna has been profoundly meaningful, the source of any success that I have achieved as part of the market process. It has been my intention in this narration to share this knowledge, and in the last 2 chapters in particular, to provide a practical application and takeaway of what we have learned. No matter what action you take as an investor, once again, what is far more important to consider is the thinking behind this methodology. Are you sure in your approach, taking the roundabout and teleological means end path, or are you Lee, focusing only on the immediate end, the returns of today? It is not for everyone. If it were, the advantages would be lost. but it remains an important ideal for every investor, no matter how they perceive the ticking of the clock. All can stand in the company of Bastiat and Menger, Böhm-Bawerk and Mises, and Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and of course Klipp, to gauge their approach. The relevant question to always ask, then, is, how far are you from the Austrian ideal? Let this one query serve as your compass and your map as you continue on your own path along the Dao of Capital. Epilogue. The Sisu of the Boreal Forest. The conifer, as the leitmotif of this audiobook, conjures up the essential lesson of the roundabout, going right with its slow yet steady development at first until finally reaching a stage of maturity at which it can go left with accelerating growth that outpaces its competition. The slow then fast pace allows the conifer to build and configure its structures, amassing the necessary capital, such as thick bark, a high canopy, and more efficient foliage. This pattern of development requires tenacity and persistence, the necessary ingredients of the roundabout. The intertemporal world of the boreal forest and its strategies of survival stretch back epochs through twists and turns, growth and decline, and internal battles for survival among competing plant species and voracious herbivorous dinosaurs. In contrast, humans, who made their appearance on the planet much later, remain overwhelmingly anchored in the realm of the present, made all the worse by our inherent wiring around time preference, so that we value, indeed overvalue, today's marshmallows more than the prospect and potential of many more to come. Our societal attention deficit disorder steals our focus away from the protracted path toward our shallow depth of field. Thus, we become prone to making short-sighted, even disastrous mistakes with decisions that undermine the ability of our forward selves, our look-ahead trees, to act opportunistically. Like the conifer, we need perseverance to equip ourselves to triumph over and from falling behind, while never being fazed by it, even to the point of loving to lose and hating to win, Klipp's paradox, which started us off along the Dao of Capital. Because of the sheer grit it engenders, and the prominence of indirect and sometimes costly means it allows. To be roundabout is to expect adversity, as opposed to just the false binary choices of failure and success. It is a prerequisite of the circuitous nature of progress itself, such as we found at the Weiqi board, where the sure strategist pursues positional advantage for later potential, which until the end of the game appears to be a losing strategy. All the while, the Li opponent goes for the more comfortable direct assault in hopes of a quick and decisive victory. The great artists and entrepreneurs and economists have well understood that anything worth doing takes time, and so have their polar opposites, the military strategists, thus giving us the spectrum of the very creators and destroyers of civilization. Each in his own way has followed the common thread of intertemporal exchange, as explained in Chapter 3, the patient pursuit of an intermediate state, the efficacy of which furthers the realization of a desired final state. And so, achievement of one's eventual Zweck only comes after much effort, moving from zeal to zeal, along with a good deal of waiting, even to the point of testing the limits of one's perseverance. Both encourager and sustainer, such tenacity maintains our resolve along the indirect route from intermediate means to eventual ends, a journey we know is nearly impossible, the circuitous road least traveled, because of that very humanness about us. To overcome our human nature takes stamina, the ability to stay focused on and committed to a goal or objective, like the roundabout conifer that moves beyond the reaches of its competitors and hunkers down among the rocks through survival adaptations, such as symbiosis with helpful fungi, all the while waiting for the opportune moment to make its move into the fertile areas after the wildfire. The epitome of sure, the conifer exemplifies the cunning of Sun Tzu's guerrilla warriors, battling across a temporal depth of field. We, too, must possess qualities that are best captured in a word that comes from deep within the boreal forest, where else of Finland. Sisu. The world learns Sisu from the victorious Finns. In the early months of World War II, not long after Ludwig von Mises's escape from the Nazis, deep within the north woods of the taiga, another battle was waged, the 100-day Winter War of 1939 through 1940, during which outgunned Finnish forces fended off the much larger Soviet army in what is perhaps the best example of sure in modern warfare. Neutral Finland was unluckily caught between the two equally evil and totalitarian clashing powers of Stalin and Hitler, and was thus an immensely valuable path between the two for whichever could seize it first. Although much is often made of the underdog story, we must recognize that the Finns' victory was not some inexplicable event. Rather, it was the result of a carefully executed strategy right out of the Sun Tzu and Vom Kriege. As we will see, the former is evident in the use of Schur, as nimble Finnish troops on skis avoided direct clashes and instead maneuvered into position within the snowy, forested terrain in order to gain the upper hand. Influence of the latter is found in the very conduct of the war, particularly by the Finns, who attacked key focal points along the advancing Soviet lines and thereby fractured a large opponent into much smaller pieces that could be surrounded, attacked, and defeated. The Red Army, too, had its share of Prussian-German influence, but Joseph Stalin had tried to purge it from the Soviet forces by imprisoning or executing many senior officers. Thus, the forces that invaded Finland were typically led by less experienced mid-level officers, who at times acted as if they were following fighting manuals written for a different time and place, such as assuming that troops would be able to ski without ever being trained for fighting and firing weapons in snow. The Soviets' unified military doctrine allowed for no flexibility in field command. They adhered to the strict dogma of decisive engagement without question or alteration. Among these many influences and factors that led to the Finnish victory, we cannot underestimate the importance of sisu. Difficult to translate, a linguistic trait shared with Schur, sisu has been compared to having guts, moxie, courage, toughness, tenacity, stubbornness, strength of will, and determination. Sisu is perhaps best thought of as a gritty perseverance, making it a natural complement to the strategic positional advantage of Schur. Inherent in sisu is intertemporal endurance, not gritting one's teeth in a difficult moment, but rather possessing fortitude that sustains along an arduous path, from one seemingly insurmountable challenge to the next. Sisu permeates the identity of the Finnish people, capturing their national character long before they were an independent nation, with a gritty perseverance rooted in the land and history. Flat forested tundra, pitted with lakes and marshes, this isolated land is plunged into Arctic darkness for a significant portion of the year, making even daily life a test of endurance at times. Overlaying such will to survive is centuries of having been a battleground for the Swedes to the west and the Russians to the east. Finland was part of the Kingdom of Sweden until it was captured by the Russians in 1809 and made into the Grand Duchy of Finland, which was then slowly assimilated into Russia. During the Russian Civil War of 1917, Finland seized the opportunity to declare its independence and held off the Russian threat with forces under the command of General Karl Gustav Mannerheim, a staunch anti-Bolshevist who had been in the court of Tsar Nicholas II. The Treaty of Tartu, signed in 1920, formally established peace between Finland and Russia, yet even then the lingering tensions foreshadowed another war to come. The strategic advantages against the threatening Nazis, such as the Gulf of Finland and large nickel deposits discovered in the former Petsamo region, later ceded to the Soviets, baited the Russian bear. Stalin wanted Finland back. Russian propaganda in late 1939 provided the cover for aggressive, overt military action. Imperialists were said to be planning to use Finland to stage an invasion of the Soviet Union, even though Finland, at the time, had a population of about 3.7 million, and the USSR's was nearly 180 million. The first shots of the war on November 26, 1939, were supposedly fired from Finnish observation posts in Soviet territory. Yet historians believe the Mainila shots, named for a nearby village, could not have been fired by the Finns, because Mannerheim had ordered all guns withdrawn from these outposts to avoid such an incident from happening. Posturing that it had been provoked, the Soviets rolled into Finland in tanks, mimicking the German blitzkrieg, which had proven effective in the heart of Europe, where there were well-defined centers of supply and communication to be targeted. The Finnish forest, however, offered no such targets, only natural obstacles that thwarted such cumbersome military operations. The Soviets further burdened themselves with truckloads of propaganda material and brass bands to celebrate what was anticipated to be a swift and decisive victory, but without winter uniforms and supplies for a prolonged campaign. What better illustration of Lee can we imagine than a direct assault with plans for a celebration before it even has begun? Sisu and Schur would become an unbeatable combination. Although the Red Army was greater in number and in weaponry, the Finns gained strategic tactical positions by combining the speed and agility of small targeted forces. White-clad bushwhacking troops, guerrilla soldiers on skis, used the terrain to their advantage, becoming like the good general of the Sun Tzu, who calculates in advance and with accuracy every factor so that the situation develops in a way as beneficial as possible to him, even to the point that victory is then simply a necessary consequence. Finland had on its side Sing, positional advantage, the boreal forest itself that came from deep knowledge of its unusual terrain. As we recall from Chapter 3, the positional advantage of Schur overlaps the concept of Sing. so that sure is the greater superiority gained through sing. The sting of troops is compared in the Sun Tzu to the positioning of pent-up water in a mountain stream, the potential, sure, of which is eventually opportunistically unleashed as it gushes downward, carrying boulders and logs in a powerful, yet effortless surge, overcoming everything in its path. Thus, the sage acts by positioning himself upstream from its full deployment. The Finns used means that were far removed from ends, in time and space, and often exceedingly indirect, by blocking roads, conducting ambushes, and antagonizing an overstretched enemy until conflict becomes a war of nerves, which allowed the Finns and their Sisu to exploit the advantages of the roundabout path. At all times, the Finnish forces avoided attacks against a strong enemy on open terrain, particularly one with such superior weaponry and air power. Instead, the Finns fought in the coniferous forests from which their victorious strategies were distilled, of fortitude to endure, persevere, and ultimately triumph, but only through time, with positional advantage obtained intertemporally. The Finns gave ground strategically in order to command a more favorable position. Wei Qi played out on a snow-covered battlefield. The Finns staged tactical retreats, feigning the rout and luring the enemy into position. Then the Finns would emerge, as if from nowhere, having amassed a strategic position unseen by the enemy, and stage a strong counterattack, including raids behind Soviet lines. The Finns' attacks targeted key focal points, Clausewitz's center of gravity or Schwerpunkt, in the pursuit of intermediate aims, thus weakening their enemy. While the Finns used the sing of the forest for offense and defense, the Soviets were thwarted by it literally. The Red Army's strategy depended upon open terrain on which to maneuver. They even brought mostly flat trajectory field guns that proved useless since they could not shoot over trees. Though captured by the Finns, those field guns were used quite handily against the former owners as they retreated. In harmony with their turf and fighting for their homeland, the Finnish army moved with the skill of tuisho, push hands, the objective of which is to exploit imbalance within one's opponent, which will make the ultimate rout all the more effective. With cold, snow, and the terrain on their side, the Finns effectively turned the force of their opponent against itself. Rather than engage the Soviets directly, the Finns yielded, even to the point of letting the Red Army advance at times along strategic roads, while sub-zero temperatures did damage to Soviet weapons, causing them to malfunction. Bogged down in snow and immobilized by cold, the Red Army could not retreat, no matter the cost, another foolhardy and highly destructive example of Lee. The sure of the Finns' non-engagement allowed them to spare lives and conserve ammunition, particularly in what the Finnish commanders called the Mati strategy, so named for the quaint Matis of cut and stacked wood, still often found along roads through the forest. The strategic meaning of the term has since become an encircling maneuver, perhaps the closest Finnish word for Wei Qi, or encircling game. Encirclement was at the very core of the Finn strategy, wherein these not-so-quaint Matis were composed of dead enemy soldiers. Under orders never to give up any captured ground, but unable to advance further, the Soviet forces became stationary units, the disastrous consequences of which meant the surrounding Finns could watch as the Red Army soldiers starved or froze to death. Along with Schur, Sisu provided an enormous edge, emboldening the Finns to face incredible odds, such as when they carried satchels loaded with TNT to within a few meters of Soviet tanks, and sometimes right up to the tanks themselves, risking detection as well as death from the blast. Such sneak attacks required grit and patience for the opportune moment to strike, Sun Tzu's bird of prey. Thus, a 30-ton tank could be destroyed by a pack of explosives carried by a soldier on skis. As the world looked on, the Winter War quickly took on mythic proportions. Today, the Battle of Suomussalmi in January 1940 is considered a military classic of what can be achieved in true sure fashion when troops that are well commanded use strategic advantage against a much larger adversary. The Soviets advanced along 2 roads in the wilderness, intending to capture the city of Oulu, a major railroad connection with Sweden, and effectively cutting Finland in 2. The Finns, though outnumbered and outgunned, prepared a brilliant plan. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo utilized the unique strengths of the Finnish JR-27 regiment that had no heavy weaponry, not even a single anti-tank gun. What the JR-27 did have was a cadre of loggers from small towns who knew the forest and how to cross-country ski. The timing and ferocity of their guerrilla attacks even unnerved the opponent at times, making the Red Army believe it was facing superior Finnish fighting forces, and certainly not ill-equipped foresters on skis. Such a strategy calls to mind Clausewitz's Vom Kriege and the advantages that cannot be regarded as the destruction of enemy's forces, but only leading up to it certainly by circuitous road. but with so much the greater effect. When the Soviet troops advanced on the small town of Urenshalomi, the JR-27 was waiting for them, with a blaze of bullets that blocked their advance. The Finns then fractured a much larger enemy into smaller pieces that could then be destroyed in retreat. The Red Army suffered thousands of casualties at Suomussalmi, compared to a few hundred for the Finns, and left behind large caches of tanks, artillery, guns, ammunition, and other supplies. In testament to Sisu, Suomussalmi was Finland's most monumental victory of the war, a perfectly executed rout. When the Winter War ended after 16 intensely fought weeks, punctuated by a savage bombing raid by the Soviets that was nothing more than retaliation for having been humiliated in battle, Finland emerged victorious and unconquered. However, in peace negotiations, Finland had to give up significant territory, what Stalin called just enough ground to bury his dead. The takeaway here for us goes beyond the Herculean efforts of the Finns in a war that is too often regarded as little more than a side note in the long narrative of World War II destruction. The Winter War serves as a powerful example of the effectiveness of the roundabout military strategy of Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, of indirect over direct, sure over Lee, achieving intermediate gains over grabbing immediate territory, and most of all, Sisu as the gritty perseverance without which such undertakings are virtually impossible. Sisu, of character and character building. The story of the Winter War, of the fortitude of Sisu over military power alone, is central to the stories Finns tell of themselves, like the 19th century epic poem Kalevala, which captures the ancient stories and mythology of Finnish culture, such as Tapio, god of the forest, and Kalevan Poika, a giant hero who cut down forests, their heroic Nordic Siegfried. Sisu, though, like Schur, does not apply only to martial or even investment strategy, but also much more broadly to living one's life with purpose and tenacity. It is also a reminder of inner strength that enables one to carry on in spite of difficulty and obstacles, speaking as it does of character and character building. A typical Finnish monument to Sisu is a lonely mound of rocks in Lapland, piled slowly and steadily one by one, perseverance in the making. My wife, who is of Finnish descent, can often quell complaint in our young children with one word, Sisu, delivered as a loving reminder to look within themselves for what they need to persevere and ultimately prevail. The benefit of Sisu is becoming increasingly understood today, particularly among psychologists who recognize the advantages it bestows. Angela Duckworth salutes grit in children as a dominant predictor of their future success, describing gritty individuals who make slow and steady progress over time despite temporary setbacks as being tortoise-like. This description should surely call to mind those accelerating tortoises, the tenacious conifers. Capitalism, as we know from the Austrians, is perhaps the grittiest of arenas. It requires enduring current disadvantage in order to achieve a later superior advantage, the essence of roundaboutness. We can think of Sisu and grit as precisely the lower time preference described by Eugene von Bombaverk, overcoming our anxiety in the present, which arises over the satisfaction of wants that will not emerge till the future. The pleasures or pains we will experience later must dictate what we will need now to facilitate or mitigate them. Yet we are ill-equipped to process such projected feelings because of what Bombaverk called the incompleteness of the imaginations we form to ourselves of our future wants, and thus we will not take the necessary trouble to give adequate consideration to our future, and particularly our faraway future wants. The gritty tenacity of Sisu is our only saving grace. It is what got us out of the primordial ooze, out of the caves, out of our day-to-day hand-to-mouth existence, and in many cases, such as the Finns, out of the menace of totalitarianism, and toward the autocatalytic world of capitalistic production. There is, of course, an element of patience in grit, but not as an abstract quality. It is not just about waiting, but rather it is purposeful, teleological, the means to work through a process and toward something. And being tenacious is not about thinking or acting long-term, my constant refrain. Rather, it is intertemporal and roundabout, thus becoming a kind of litmus test. If a strategy does not require grit, then it is aligned with neither the roundabout nor capitalistic progress that got us to where we are today. We mustn't forget this, and mustn't allow ourselves to be sidetracked by the sideshows of capitalism, the securities markets, and rather stand down from that game and choose for ourselves which game we play. Without the ability to forego immediacy, civilization would be doomed to follow the Phineas Gages who are ruled by their appetites in the now. Perseverance, when coupled with an intertemporal depth of field, enables us to create and configure tools by which our civilization progresses, Thus, the words used throughout this audiobook, sure and umvig, and now sisu, unlock nothing less than the fate of humanity. Yet few appreciate the roundabout, because we only see the final product or result, the end of an interval and process, and not the means, the winding path that produced it. Fortunately, we do have role models who have blazed the roundabout trail, great strategic thinkers, decision-makers, and actors from throughout history, in every society and in every era, Daoists, militarists, economists, industrialists, the heroic Siegfrieds of the Dao of Capital. Across centuries and thousands of miles, on battlefields and through the sweep of the great boreal forest, they demonstrate passionate commitment to universal principles for the teleological pursuit of means toward ends. Drawing from the lives and lessons of these greats, I hope I have given listeners a strategic framework by following its roots, from natural history to the warring states of China and Europe to modern economic thinkers. The concept of a framework, as opposed to a formula, is an important one. Even Austrian Investing, rather than providing precise instructions, is meant to be scaffolding for the roundabout process from which anyone's degree of capitalistic investment can be better understood and gauged. We can think of such investing as a work in progress, rather than focusing on disparate results. Thus, we heed the Stoics' and Bastiat's good economists' call to get neither too excited about our victories, nor too disappointed by our defeats. I know from much experience, pretty much without exception, that you can always tell an ultimately good trader from a bad one by this simple test. It is equanimity, sisu. When the game is played correctly, the results are but indirect mittel to our zweck. For investors, the roundabout of Austrian investing, as laid out in chapters 9 and 10, requires tenacity, which bestows an edge that even seemingly sophisticated Wall Street investors, who may have certain order flow and market intelligence advantages, both of which skirt what is or should likely be legal, cannot match. Wall Street's institutional myopia keeps it playing in the shadows, rather than being able to see what is really going on because of insatiable appetites for the immediate. Gritty sisu, however, allows one to feed upon such insatiableness in the market, as noted in Chapter 1. My mantra is inspired by a baseball pitcher's creed, who earned his living from the hungriness of hitters. Striving to satisfy only immediate profits, however, is truly, in the words of Henry Ford, putting the cart before the horse. This quintessential entrepreneur of the 20th century understood intuitively that it was all about ever more roundabout means, patiently and laboriously accumulated, followed at last by impatient pursuit of ends in the final stages of production. From this perspective, we might even see capitalism itself as a zeal, a way station along the path toward a much bigger zweck, a far grander sure strategy. We may be making nets and boats with the intention of catching more fish, but what we are actually doing, over many forward slices of time, is advancing society. The Austrians understood this, especially Mises, who saw in capitalism an expression of the freedom of the individual to act according to free will and self-determination. Thus, in his stand for capitalism, Mises also stood for freedom. How symbolically fitting was it that, in the wee hours of the morning as I completed a late-night writing session, the very top volume of a stack of books on my desk, no less than 10 high, suddenly toppled and hit a memento I keep as the symbol of the ultimate victory of capitalism and freedom, a large chunk of the fractured and defeated Berlin Wall. The falling book was Mises's Human Action, and its impact further cleaved the Berlin Wall. Such images become inspiration for the exceedingly difficult journey of the roundabout. We carry these things mentally as intellectual and emotional talismans, and sometimes even physically. I make it a point, perhaps as a gambler's tick, though like my old Adam Smith necktie, also a constant reminder, to pick up a conifer cone whenever I see one. This happens every day outside my door, whether redwoods in Southern California, or the even more roundabout tribes at the cusp of the boreal forest in Michigan. It is as ordinary an object as anyone could imagine, and yet it is extraordinary, profundity in the quotidian, a living embodiment of the tenacity developed from the prehistoric age, when the late-coming angiosperms barreled into the prime areas like so many sprinting hares and drove out the slow-growing at first conifers in a route to the rocky places. As we recall from Chapter 2, by the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, 9 out of every 10 vascular plant species were angiosperms. But let those angiosperms grow impatiently, hogging sunlight and choking off competitors, even from within their own species. The conifers can wait, a phalanx of patient capital producers with time on their side. As an adult, just as when I was a child, the outdoors is my preferred milieu, particularly in the company of craggy old conifers. In this, I am not alone. As Finland has become known as the land of sauna, sisu, and Sibelius, all three are even combined in the latter's country estate, Einola, a log villa deep in the coniferous wooded lake region north of Helsinki. For the record, Jean Sibelius is probably still the world's most underappreciated composer. Others, the likes of Contrarian, as well as myself, have tried to emulate Sibelius's refuge in a country retreat, similar to the summer retreats of the great Austrian composer Gustav Mahler. One can hear the echoes of their boreal forest home in their sweeping idyllic music. The forest is a source of endless teachings. When I was a boy in Michigan, Hemingway's boyhood northern woods was the ideal child's domain, where rocks, logs, and lakes became fortresses, outposts, and the terrain from which to wage campaigns of exploration and conquest. Sun Tzu and Clausewitz would have been proud. For my friends and me, it was all in good fun. Little did we know we were actually pursuing an important zeal as we exercised our bodies and minds, learned skills, and deployed our imaginations, all essential to our development. When left to their own desires, children can be naturally roundabout insofar as pursuing the intermediate objectives of play, and with a great deal of gusto, even though it does not produce anything, tree forts and airplane models notwithstanding. Yes, children will grab for the immediate marshmallow, but when it comes to development, nature tricks them with the enticement of play that is part of the roundabout accumulation of cognitive abilities, creativity, physical attributes such as strength and balance, and interpersonal relationships, all of which will later bear fruit as the skills and aptitudes deployed by a forward self, the adult. Because their prefrontal lobes are underdeveloped, children are blind to their long-term goals, although their parents tend to have better than 20/20 vision in such matters. Thankfully, children are thus inclined, otherwise they might look askance at play and dismiss it as a worthless objective, while trying to cram for SAT examinations starting at the age of 6. I agree with the conclusion of Paul Tough, who in his book How Children Succeed, cited research that shows what matters most in a child's development is not how much information we can stuff into her brain in the first few years, but rather non-cognitive qualities that include self-control, curiosity, self-confidence, and grit. To that list I would add, of course, in summary, sisu. Intuitively, we would all want our children to have greater capacity for the roundabout and the gritty perseverance of sisu, thus equipping them for life well beyond anything material or even the advantages gained through a superior education. With sisu and sure come the ability to withstand the direct assault and remain indirect in one's outlook and actions, to never go for the immediate but seek instead intertemporal opportunism. We would further give them the ability and tolerance for deliberate exploration and discovery, what we might think of as production, through a prolonged period of ambiguity and uncertainty, along with a general lightness of spirit, plus the subsequent sweat of exertion. These are the lessons that nature teaches us. To learn them, we must be in nature's classroom. Even for a child, it is nearly impossible to miss the fact that every conifer bears countless cones, which for kids are quite handy missiles to launch at friends, perhaps helping with seed dispersal. And within each of those cones are innumerable seeds. Pretty soon, it becomes clear that to cradle a cone in one's hand is to hold an entire forest. What became a fond childhood memory was brought back to me in Clip's folksy wisdom that anyone can see the pine cones in the tree. None can see the trees. None can foresee the forest in the pine cone. And as a youngster, seeing some of those conifers in out-of-the-way places, such as along windswept hills overlooking Lake Michigan, I couldn't help but wonder why they were growing there. Surely there were better places. In time, that question would be answered, with a deep appreciation for the false humility of the conifer sage that only appears to retreat. Even in the midst of the rout, the conifer is merely waiting, outliving its neighbors and becoming poised to take over their living space. The conifer's eventual zweck is not achieved by rushing headlong into the fray, but rather by enduring the uncomfortable places on the rocks. Such discomfort becomes bearable because there are advantages to come over time. Longevity is an attribute of the species. A secondary roundabout strategy of the conifer, of course, gives the advantage to its offspring sown from wind-borne seeds, or in some conifers, serotinous cones, scorched and opened by wildfire. The conifer's gritty nature allows it to persist where others cannot. No wonder, then, that ancient Daoist Chinese scholars depicted the pine growing on the rocks as the symbol of stalwart tenacity. Such images long ago painted on bamboo and silk scrolls still remind us today of the endurance known as sisu, of the conifer and nature's compelling logic, that out of what appears to be disadvantage and devastation comes opportunistic conquest. This is the very model of organic efficacious growth in our world. All that wisdom Indeed, the summation of every word in this audiobook is contained in a deceptively mundane object that weighs but a few ounces, and through which, in the words of William Blake, you hold infinity in the palm of your hand, a humble pine cone. Worth nothing, neither rare nor unusual, it is like the Tao itself, failing to catch the eye or interest. To most, its meaning remains unseen, yet to those who know what they are beholding, it is nothing less than a marvel. In the pine cone is a visible reminder of a practical discipline, the tenacious, unyielding pursuit of intermediate means as strategic advantage for achieving the ultimate ends, a quest only possible for those who dare to take the roundabout route.